Good morning.
Good morning.
Well, when I first took over Prosit, I think it was in 2004, I did a couple issues, and a good friend of mine out in California, he doesn't usually come to the lectures, that's Steve Elliott. He said to me, you know, with what you do for a living with the auctions, you see a lot of collections. Why don't you take some pictures and do a series, photos from the road? So I can't take credit for the concept. I just kind of stepped in the shoes and did it. And it's been very, very popular. It's fun seeing people's collection and being able to take photos of things that you don't normally see and then share it with the members. So this is kind of not the most expensive Steins always, but things that are kind of unusual and we can talk about. Oh. Could you hit those lights back there, please? Well, back in the mid-1970s, I've been collecting since the late 60s. I got interested in early Steins, and back then there wasn't a whole lot of knowledge within the club about early stoneware, and nobody really knew the differences between, we knew that's a faience Stein, but nobody could tell the factories, and it became a lifelong study for me. This piece here is a Freiberg piece, and it's on like every different stoneware factory has techniques and traits all onto themselves. And in the Saxonia region, there's about 6 or 7 different factories, and once you've seen one factory and their traits, it'd be very difficult to mix them up. So Freiberg looks like no other factory. You see the florets on the top band there. They made tools, impression tools, so they were kind of stamped into it when the clay was soft, and then they were enameled. And then you got that crisscross work, what they call. The lid on it is by Samuel Günther, which is all hand chased. A very typical kind of lid that you'd find on this factory alone. Occasionally you may see it on another early piece, and you'll know that that lid was maybe appropriate to the piece, but should only be on a Freiberg. This piece is only about 2.5 inches tall. It's Viennese enamel. They're either enameled on copper or on silver, but really fine work. Yesterday we had Wednesday we had a series of animals. This is part of that series. We had a bull and a bear, a rhino, an elephant, and this one is really difficult to come by. This is the donkey. You know, when you first look at something, you may look at the decoration, but beyond the enamel floral decoration, this piece has great optics. When this was blown into a mold, you'll see that they have vertical lines that appear because of the mold that it was blown into. So when light passes through it, you've got vertical optics to it. Besides which, you see that it's got a series of bands going up from the base to the upper body, and the matching inlaid lid. So you've got what we would call interior fluting to it. You see a lot of stoneware, but it's rare that you're going to find a shelf that's actually in stoneware. This lion, you attach it to the wall and then you put a nice stoneware piece on top of it. It's just unusual to find that it's not a stein or a jug or a flower pot on top of a jardiniere. Pretty unusual. Reinhold Hanke did a series of comical steins with early automobiles. You see the car here, and the chicken is kind of looking at him because the chicken almost got run over. Here's just another, they're just motoring down the street. You know, back then we didn't have cement or asphalt, so you leave a big trail of dust. Here you got a guy kind of laying down in the road. I'm not sure why he's laying down before the car passes, but... And then you see this young boy just kind of mesmerized by this car that just went past him. Because you got to realize in those days the automobile was in its infancy, so it's kind of today, you know, if you think of the Wright brothers, you see an airplane in the 1910, 1920, that would be quite unusual. So cars were quite unusual in this period. Here's a blown glass piece made of amber, and it's kind of done like the garland you'd put around a Christmas tree. And the green that's on the amber just kind of, it's like it's dripping down like a cake. Just kind of an interesting. And if you look at over here on the hinge, real fancy hinge skirts on both sides of the hinges. So the pewter was really fancy. This is a Bohemian piece. It's amber stained. It's about 1850. Probably 1850, 1860 is the height of the best Bohemian glass, where the techniques and the talent of the wheel cutting was at its premier place. Yesterday, Walt talked about intaglio, where they would stone wheel grind the depth, and then they put the fine work in with a copper wheel cutting. But this is when you see colored glass, where it's what they call cut to clear, amber is always a stain, cobalt is always an overlay, and ruby can be either. It can be a stain or an overlay. This is just an unusual Metlock print on the glaze made for the colleges. Sculling or rowing was very popular in the colleges, both in Europe and America. Great competitions they'd have between the schools, as they do now today. You see it in the Olympics. Here's a silver tankard. The technique is called hand chased. They would roll out that silver, but then the guy would take tools and he would hammer on the silver to punch out the design and make it in relief. The average person didn't do this. This was a real talent of the goldsmiths and the silversmiths. So when you find silver tankards and you see this kind of detail, they're pretty nice and makes a nice addition to a collection. This is a 3-liter, and you see the innkeeper kind of saying farewell to the guys, and here's the other side of it. Just a real fancy piece. You see the cherub blowing the horn. That's usually a thumb lift used by the Littinger Munich pewter factory. They did some of the finest pewter work and pewter lids. They worked for lidded Steins for Metlock and Sargamines and quite a few other Stein manufacturers. This is a piece from Agerman. You see that white marble-like appearance to it. It's internally decorated, and that's called variegated. So that's a technique that you'll only see on pieces made from Agerman. Agerman, the family goes back to the early 1800s, and they were the ones that developed transparent stains, transparent enamels. They developed really great opaque enamels, and they also developed uranium glass, what we would call in this country Vaseline glass. And the real uranium was put into the mix. So you have a green uranium and a yellow uranium, and Agerman's wife her name was Anna. So it's Anna Grün and Anna Gelb, which means Anna Green and Anna Yellow. So he named it after his wife. Carved ivory is just fantastic. Depending upon the carver, you see just great works of art. Unfortunately, the government has got into declaring what we should own and not own. And I understand, I love animals, so I understand that we want to protect the elephants and the rhinos from the poachers. But things that were made 100, 200, 300 years ago to have the environmentalists come into a show and confiscate this stuff and then have them destroyed, that's not helping the elephants at all at this point. So up until about 6 months ago, they criminalized anybody that was collecting ivory, and it really wasn't fair. You can't list them on eBay, you can't list them on live auctioneers. Once you use the word ivory, they'll come and take it down immediately. So when I have an ivory tankard, I just say carved horn, and the buzzword doesn't come up, and it stays up until it's sold. You got to figure a way around it. It's just another view. You've got a Roman soldier, and there's a battle scene. The mounts are all hand-chased, and they're gilded silver mounts. This is just a beautiful piece. Royal Vienna, you know, technically there's no such thing as Royal Vienna Steins out of Austria. We call them Royal Vienna Steins, but in actuality they were made in Dresden, Germany, and this just unusual matched pair with oriental scenes on them. This is from a company called Riedel. You know, when you think of enamel glass, everybody knows the word Moser, and everything that's enameled is Moser. Well, in reality, Moser probably made 10% of what we call Moser. This is Riedel. They were great, fantastic, detailed enamelers. If you go into a pub in Germany today, probably 90% of the goblets and the glassware that they use at the bar was made by this company, Riedel. Van Hoyten was a company that Villeroy and Bach had a share in, and they were in Bonn, Germany. That's why you see a lot of their VB bodies used for decoration. So here's the same scene put on a Metlock VB body and on a glass stein, but made from the same factory. Here's another Agerman piece. You see the elaborate heraldic shield on it. You see how many prunts you have on the lower body, on the upper body, and the nice thing about Agerman, they always, in most cases, put enamel decoration on the prunts. You see there's the blue and the white, which gives it a whole different dimension. And another thing with Agerman is they had these big tiered inlaid lids that were enameled that matched the body. Just, you don't see it from many of the other factories. Here's just a unusual VB. It's a VB relief body, and usually the shield will be something that's Germanic, maybe a student shield or a state shield, but here we have the American shield, which is pretty uncommon. Nice 1 liter stein, and along with Bob Hurley, there's a bunch of us that are kind of attracted to jousting knights, and you see how decorated his horse is. So it's just a real attractive piece. We see a lot of occupationals. Another plug for Phil. If you didn't get his occupational book, you're doing yourself a disservice. So pick up a book in the Stein sale room before you go home. But you don't see a lot of glass occupationals, and this chimney sweep is really nicely enameled, and how funny it would be to have a collection of occupationals that were just done on glass steins. Here's an Art Nouveau piece, with just relief pewter overlay, and you see the design of the Art Nouveau. But what's really neat is the seal that is kind of coming out of the water as the lid, and his head becomes the thumb lift. We have a lot of threaded relief steins, and I'm going to throw down a challenge. Everybody wants to call them, everything is Diesinger. Well, in reality, not every threaded relief stein was made by Diesinger. So if somebody wanted to take on the challenge of this, figuring out which pieces were from what factory, that would be a great help to the club and for education. Nuremberg had the gooseman as one of its symbols for the city, but it also had the symbol of the funnel of knowledge. You'll see comical scenes where the funnel is stuck into a guy's head and they're pouring beer into it, and the beer represented knowledge. I haven't seen too many knowledgeable drunks in my life. So the Stein on the left is a rendition signed by Franz Ringer, and the pewter Stein on the right is a character Stein of the funnel, which you don't see too often. And that comes in a half-liter size and a miniature size. I love lids. When the lid is three-dimensional and continues the theme of the Stein, here you've got a Saka Stein made in pottery relief, probably J.W. Remy, and instead of having a pewter lid, you've got a big ball that comes down and sits into the cradle of the rim of the Stein. So just a really neat Stein to find. You'll find this normally with a pewter lid. When you can find it with this three-dimensional three-dimensional lid of the soccer ball, you've done something. And it's pretty heavy lid, so in most cases, if that lid slammed down, it probably was the last time it was closed.
Ron, is that ball solid?
No. As you open it up, it's not, the ball, or the circumference of it continues within the Stein, but then there's a flat spot with a hole in it to keep it not completely full. If it was solid, you opened up the Stein, it would fall over. So the lid isn't as heavy as it appears. This is just a really neat Stein. It was at Elks Convention, and all dealing with hunting and fishing. You see there's an elk on the front of it. There's a really great figural fish as the handle, and as you can see, you've got a frog on the lid. And here's another view you can see of the fish, and you see that the convention was in Portland, Oregon. You know, to find souvenir Steins that are that descriptive and that much fun, and you live in the city, how can you not want it? Here's another Stein where you see that you got a three-dimensional lid that goes along with the theme of the Stein, these three big acorns. If you like cats, you know, anybody know the Red Hat Society? Women get together and for lunch and they wear these big red hats, and this kind of reminds me of that. The cat on the left has a green hat, the cat on the right has a red hat, but well-dressed cats. Here's another cat where what I like about that is you have two different techniques. The cat itself is raised opaque enamel, and then the floral scene is in transparent enamel, so you have two different types of enamel on one Stein, which gives it really great contrast. I happen to like these Steins that are what some people will call Mary Gregory, which is a misnomer, but they're white enameled figures, but the face and the hands are flesh tone. And I've got about 40 different ones, and when you put them all on a shelf and you see different people, some of them are occupational, but the characters on them are all whitely enameled with the faces in flesh. It's just a really great little collection, side collection. My wife thinks I have too many side collections. This is just kind of interesting to see that they put the same Vancouver shield on a beaker as well as a mug, both of them V&B. In Switzerland, there were two Stein manufacturers. There was Winterthur and there was Thun. I think it's spelled T-H-U-N-E, but it's pronounced like T-O-O-N. And this is Winterthur. Winterthur goes back to the 16th century. They made Hafnerware tankards. This piece is, 1880, 1890. It's quite attractive, and it has a big, deep, false bottom, so it looks like a 1.5, 2 liter size, but it's actually just a 1 liter. Here's a side scene of it. This is attractive to me because the fox that's on it, and the enameling is done. The fox is running through the snow, and he's found a few bunnies to chase. About 25, 30 years ago, John Lamb and I went traveling in London, and we went into an antique shop, and we found this Stein, and it's made of shark skin over silver, or what they call chagrin. We've never seen one before or since, and I believe that that piece now is in the Judy Stewart collection. It's really one-of-a-kind type of things. You'll see them in cigarette cases and little Battersea boxes, but I've never seen a tankard other than this one. Here's another Viennese enamel, but instead of it being a miniature, this is a half-liter Stein. You see that not only is the body and the lid finely enameled, the whole relief handle has enamel on it as well. These can get quite expensive, and they're really more like jewelry, and the people that are willing to pay the most amount of money are not Stein collectors. They're people that collect Viennese enamel of, you may have a candlestick or a jewelry box, and they don't care that it's a Stein, they just care about the technique that they're buying. Here's another view of the other side. It's rare to find a Stein made out of leather. This is leather, it's 18th century, and then it's lacquer painted. Here's another view of it. Very, very difficult material to find in the shape of a Stein. You know, it's kind of funny, the Stein manufacturers or the Stein makers over in Germany, some of the materials that they use were just ornamental. You'll see basket Steins. Well, to have a Stein made out of a basket wasn't really functional. They would have to line the interior of it with pitch, and I don't know if you've ever smelled what pitch smells like. You really wouldn't want your beer in there drinking it out of it. So it wasn't really functional. You know, they didn't make them for you to really use them, but they were more ornamental. Lenox Steins are pretty varied, and usually they'll be in tones of green and blue. It's rare to find a Lenox Stein where it's multicolored. That didn't happen very often. So this is just an oddity within that factory. Here's a Westerwald Stein, big 1.25 liter with the hand-scratched eagle into it. Just a really, there's some collectors that really like the eagle theme, and that may be the majority of their collection. Here's a really nice Berlin Faience Stein, again with an eagle. This is probably 1740. It just makes it very attractive. Here's an enameled Pokal or Humpen, and it's what they call Reichsadler Humpen. It's an eagle, and the wings of the eagle have all the state shields of that time. Really well done, and this piece is probably about 16 inches tall and much wider than the photo makes it look, but really enameled all the way around. There isn't any part of the body that doesn't have enamel on it. Here's a Royal Vienna type, and when you see these, they always have a side seam. They've got really heavy brass mounts, the hinge and the thumb lift. This one is particularly good looking. Scherholz made a variety of character Steins, and I believe there'll be a talk on Sunday. But the ones that were full-bodied and done in color, this is the mushroom woman. This isn't too easy to come by, but just really, really cute and dainty. Usually the women that, the wives of collectors that will allow Steins would like this in their collection, and they claim it. That's mine. There was a series of Steins that were done in pottery, and we did an article in Prosa maybe 2 years ago and discovered who the manufacturer was. I believe it was Arvid Frende came up with what the initials on the back of it was, and Knugen, and I know it's not pronounced right, but that's when I look at the name of the factory, that's how I would pronounce it. But they all seem to have a tilted head, and they're just really, they're not common, so when you find them, you've achieved something, and there's probably about 15 or so, and a couple of them, there's only one of a kind that we know. And as I get to them, I'll point that out. This is just an interesting matlock that was made, the 100-year anniversary for the factory in Wallerfagen, Villeroy-Bach Wallerfagen, from 1791 to 1891. So I'm sure that was in-house, made for the employees, and it wasn't a production piece made for the public. You know, there's a lot of wedding beakers, and everybody says, oh, that's a Fritz Heckert wedding beaker. In reality, the distributor or the manufacturer of these things was the company that made the metal body. You know, it's kind of like a pot metal that's been gilded. It's not pewter. It's very, very soft, and it doesn't, I should say it's very, very brittle. So if you bend the arms, they'll break pretty easy. You think they're brass, but they're not. This is by Myers-Neff. There's probably at least 6 different glass makers that supplied the bodies. When they were sold, they weren't sold by the glass maker, they were sold by the body maker. But these parts were supplied by Myers-Neff. And this electric blue color to the glass is, in my opinion, one of the best looking because of the color. Here we have a Bayreuth faience, and the foot is called Glockenfuß, or a bell-shaped foot to this. It's rare to find a faience Stein that has a deep hollow base to it. So this is kind of an unusuality for 18th century faience Steins. Very attractive piece. You usually find this tower in pottery. It's rare to find it in stoneware with the cobalt and the manganese decoration to it. So this is a real oddball for this tower. Here's another carved ivory where you don't have metal mounts at all. The Stein is made completely out of ivory, including the hinge and the handle. And but really, and this is probably at least 1820, if not earlier. It's if you did a study on ivory on trying to determine the age that they were carved, it's a lot of fun. But this is just a magnificent ivory piece. You see that it's set up on 4 feet, and each one of the feet has a woman's face that's carved. You got a 3-dimensional woman as the handle, and then you've got, I believe, a cherub with a goat on as the finial to the lid. Just very, very elaborate. And the Capodimonte Steins were made in this vein. If you look at a battle scene or a typical Capodimonte and you think about ivory steins, you see the similarities. Okay, we don't have color on the ivory, but you have the same kind of relief work and the same kind of war scenes, and you'll see Bacchus and Pan and Greek mythology, typical for both the Steins. Von Heider was a manufacturer of drainage pipes in Munich, and around 1890, 1900, because they had a kiln and everything, they got involved in making some Steins. Most all of their Steins are Art Nouveau in form. I know there's a rooster that they did also has an Art Nouveau form to it. You'll see one that we call the Bat Stein, and it looks like a bat mask on the front of it. So they didn't make many Steins, but maybe a dozen or so different variations. This is kind of shaped like the old Coke glasses. Tremendous, tremendous enameling on it, Art Nouveau in form. Just, there's not much you need to say about it other than it's eye candy. This piece is a ruby overlay that's heavily, heavily cut and faceted, and then you've got what we would call pasty enamel. Pasty enamel is when they would put a off-white or an ivory or a yellow enamel on the piece, and then they would gild over the top of it, and that's what we call pasty enamel. It was really, that trait and technique was something that the Persian market liked. So most of these pieces weren't made for the European market or the American market. They were made for the Persian market. The Persians bought a lot of glass, and there's a whole line of glass that was made specifically for their taste. This is a Bohemian cameo piece where it's a ruby overlay, and instead of it being taglio cut, they cut away the background and they left the figure in the color, and they would cut to different depths. If they went, as you can see, if they went all the way through the ruby, they were to clear. But if they only went partially through the ruby, you had variance of color, and it was the depth of the cut that gave you the image. And this was the hardest wheel cutting technique. It's a kind of a lost art today. Some of the best cutters, Walt had mentioned them, probably the best cutter was Franz Zach. His pieces bring the most money and have the greatest detail. Here's the intaglio cut. So this you see the figure is in the color. This you see that the figure is in the clear. So one is a negative cut, one is a positive cut, if you look at it that way. This is a cobalt Stein of a hunter, and it's what I call the pole shape, tall and slender. And most of my glass Steins must conform to that tall, slender shape. If you don't give yourself parameters, you wind up with 500 glass Steins. I don't have room for 500. So I've confined myself through the years. It must be that tall, slender shape, and even then, I've accumulated too many. Here's an opaque milk glass Stein, occupational. You don't see that very often. This is about 1770, 1780. Just a really nice piece. It's made for a carpenter. It also has really nice enameling along the sides as well. This piece is a fraternal dueling student, and each student for society had different colors. So you will see this same Stein in a variety of different colors depending upon the colors of the student society. So they were definitely made for the students, and you see that he used his sword not so well. In this country, you know, in the 50s and the 60s, men would get 1 or 2 tattoos, and that was the kind of a sign of manhood. Over there, from the 50s back, it was a sign of virility to have cuts on your cheeks, because you wanted to be cut. And there was a guy that I was very friendly with that dealt in enamel glass, and he had some pretty good cuts on both of his cheeks, and he was pretty proud of them. This guy probably got his eye poked out too. He was really proud. You see this Stein in the typical honey colors. It's a Scherholz barmaid, and to date only 2 of them have surfaced in full color. I've got the Turkish man in color and the Alpine man in color, and they're both waiting, anticipating her to arrive one day. There has to be a 3rd one. But she's really gorgeous. When you get into early Hafnerware, you got several kinds of materials of clay that Steins were made out of. You know, everybody knows stoneware, which is vitrified, and porcelain, which was also vitrified but had translucency to it, and then earthenware that would have a lead glaze on it. That's what Hafnerware is. It's made out of earthenware, and it has to be coated with a glaze on the outside or the inside, because if they didn't, if you put water in it, eventually the water would leach through. So it's not dense. Where stoneware and porcelain are, water will not penetrate it. So that's the difference. But this piece is 16th century. It's probably from Preuning in Nuremberg, but regardless of that, you don't see too many 16th century Hafnerware Steins. This is a real honey. And it's got a sandy or pebbly finish to the body. They did the same thing with stoneware. They would use flint rock and pebbles, and they would press it into the clay before they fired it, and you'd have that protruding out of the Stein in different places in patterns. They use it for decoration. The Altenburg factory, one of the other Saxonia factories, we all know the beaded work or the pearl work. It's very rare to find Altenburg where it's been enameled. It was not a technique that was commonly used at that factory. In fact, if you read the Salon books that were printed, there's a series of them in England around the turn of the century, the author really frowned on the companies that use, the stoneware companies that use color. It was like, it was sacrilegious. You should just use the clay and the salt glaze and the firing techniques, whether you starved it for oxygen or you added oxygen, which changed the color of the piece, but you don't enamel the Stein. I'm glad they enameled a few. Great piece. This is a Freshen piece. You have Rhenish stoneware, which you have Cologne, you have Freshen, you have Rehren. You see that it's a Bartman Krug. You know it's Freshen because you see the spotted glaze on it. That was a very typical technique from the Freshen factory. But you've got a belly stamp on it, and in the belly stamp you've got some cobalt color, which just is an added bonus. In regimentals, there was 2 hussar units that were Death Head squadrons. The logo for the unit was a skull and crossbones. I believe this is a 23rd Hussar from Braunschweig. But really, really tough to find with the skull and crossbones on it. About 30 years ago, I got a phone call from a friend of mine that I used to go to Germany probably 20 times a year. I was on and off the plane all the time. But he called me and said, hey, there's a stoneware auction in Amsterdam tomorrow. You want to come? So I called my travel agent, got a ticket. I called a taxi and said, a $200 tip if you can get me to the airport by this time, because otherwise I would have missed the flight. He got me. He drove on the sidewalk, on the grass. But they do that in New York no matter what anyway. So I got there, and all of this Rhenish stoneware was this regimental with this shako helmet lid, and I bought that for very, very little money. It's now in a collection down in Southern California where he only collects East German units. But it's just a great Stein. You never know what you're going to find when you go out looking. Here's a typical Westerwald piece. It's got both the cobalt and the manganese glaze on it. This piece is probably anywhere from 1680 to 1720. Just a very attractive piece. When you get into that period, you don't normally, or more times than not, you won't have a ball thumb lift. You'll have that early shell thumb lift. Here's another piece of Hafnerware, and you see that it's got kind of a manganese fish scale design. This piece is also, I think it's like 1720, 1730, but just really, really attractive and different. There's such a variety of colors and appearance and shapes in the early pieces, and once you start with it, everything else kind of loses its glow. Here's a piece that I chased for quite some time. They're not very common. The piece was in the Schaefer collection on Long Island, and when the Stroh Brewery bought the Schaefer Brewery, the Stein collection moved to Michigan. Then the collection was sold at auction. I showed up at the auction and I wanted this piece, and John Stewart, who liked oddball Steins, made it quite clear that I shouldn't bid on it, so he got that one. And then one showed up at another auction, and somebody else in this room bought that one. And then finally on German eBay one showed up, and I didn't have any competition, and I got that one. So I only know of 3 of them. It's pressed leather over wood, and the same thing, the inlay is done the same way, but just really unusual type of Stein from just before the turn of the century. This is just a magnificent Kreuzen. It's as wide as it is tall. It's a true hump in shape. And the word humpin', for me, my understanding, is short and wide and squatty. But the enameling on this is just phenomenal. It's got a big, massive lid. The lid is of the period. This Stein is probably 1640 to 1660. Just a great piece. There was a glass manufacturer, we don't know who, that made these brass stacked lids. And they would just keep adding brass and adding brass. It's all layered into this pile, this delicate pile of, it's just a wonderful lid. I have a Stein that requires one of these, and I've been looking for about a dozen years to find it for a Stein that I have. So far I haven't been able to, but the lid makes the Stein. Here's another carved ivory. You've got Pan, and I don't know who his sidekick is, but he's half goat and half human with horns. And you've got kind of a battle scene, and just, again, a real delicate. Ivory isn't for everybody, but if you really like carving, if you like carved wood, then you'll like carved ivory because it's unlimited, the detail they can put into it. You don't find too much Oriental porcelain. You have both Chinese porcelain and you have Japanese porcelain. And Japanese porcelain only came about because the wars that happened in China stopped the flow of Oriental porcelain into Europe. And the very affluent people, they judged their wealth by how much Oriental porcelain they had. So this was considered white gold. And when the Chinese porcelain stopped being able to come out of China because of the wars, then there was a company or a factory in Arita, Japan. This is a Chinese piece, and I'll show you the Arita pieces a little later. So, but these are 17th century pieces from the 1600s. This has silver mounts on it. The pieces were made and shipped to Germany, and then they were mounted with lids in Germany. Here's another Royal Vienna, and just the innkeeper. I was telling somebody yesterday there's 3 or 4 different factories that use this technique in Dresden. And the way you want to rate them are, usually the cobalt ones have flat gold. So if you feel the gold all the way around it, it's not raised. The better quality is where they used white or yellow enamel florals, and then they gilded that. So when you feel the gold around the sides and the back, it's raised. It's a raised pattern along with the gilding. So when you don't have the raised gold, they're still desirable, but they don't bring the same amount of money as if you do have the raised gold. This is a piece that was in the collection in down in Carmel, California, and just absolutely a fantastic piece. I remember when it went into a Stein book and the author put a price on it that wasn't what the owner thought it should be. There was a little bit of an argument. But it's a magnificent piece. Now I have a similar body that needs one of these stacked brass lids, and I've had it for quite some time, but I haven't been able to get it lidded. But this is magnificent. You know, in every battalion you had a medic, and regimentals are priced based upon how scarce they are. As you've seen Wednesday, if it's a one-of-a-kind Stein, it can bring a one-of-a-kind price. So the Red Cross Steins, and even if it doesn't have the Red Cross on it, you look for the word Sanitas Gefreida. That means he was a medic. So if in the unit designation it says Sanitos, you've got a decent Stein. So sometimes it's just one little word that's on a Stein that changes the value a great deal. But regimentals are a study all unto themselves. You don't find many glass regimentals. They're very uncommon. Here you've got a cavalry, I believe it's a dragoon. Okay, hussar. I don't have my glasses on. I just know he's on a horse. Anyway, if you find a regimental and it's done on a glass body, don't pass it up. They're pretty scarce. Here's a Luftschiffe. You got to realize right around the turn of the century, we didn't have airplanes, but we had hot air balloons, and they had an experimental unit in Munich that used the hot air balloons or the Zeppelins to go out and kind of judge what the enemy was doing. So a Luftschiffe is tough to find. I sold one recently for a lot of money a couple auctions ago. Because it was experimental, you don't see it. Then as we get just before World War I, we have motorized air corps. And when you can find one of those, they're really scarce. Years ago, I walked into a show. I was living in New York. I flew to California, and the Del Mar show in Southern California, it was me, Mark Durbin, Andre Amelanx, and Les Paul. And two of them went one way in the show. It was the fourth day of a four-day show. And me and Mark Durbin went the other way. And I walked into a booth, and there was this big porcelain Stein, and it was to a Luftschiffe at an airport. And I bought it for very little money, and everybody was mad at me. He said, we should have went left. Here's another Luftschiffe. This has got the double whammy. It's a rare unit on a rare material. So you've got a Luftschiffe on a glass body. Now, this is pretty rare. This would bring a swinging price. Here's another really attractive Art Nouveau Stein. You see all the flowers. But again, with glass, it's important to appreciate and notice the optics. You see that it has a linear design in the glass itself because it was blown into a mold. I bought this piece, my first trip to Europe in 1984. My travel agent, instead of booking me into Frankfurt, she booked me into Brussels, and I said, but that's not where I want to go. And she said, well, you're an adult. You're afraid to travel? So I landed in Brussels, and a friend of mine came and picked me up, and there's an antique square called Sublime in Brussels, and I walked into an antique shop, and they had two of these, and the price was 78,000, whatever their currency was. And 78,000. I'm thinking, well, I guess I'm not buying that. And my friend said, well, let's see what the translation is. Turned out to be $300 for two of them. So it sounded like a lot of money. We went to Japan recently, and everything is 500,000 yen. And that's $3, you know. It's like, why don't you lower, get rid of some of these zeros? Very attractive for the character collectors is to have the Scherholz pieces in the blue decoration. So here you've got a half liter and a 3/10 liter and a 3 liter sad radish. So it really makes a nice grouping. This Stein is from Dubler and Bryden. Many times people were trying to figure out who he was. He's actually a gladiator frog. They thought he was from Mars or something. But when you really look at him, he's a gladiator, but he's a frog. You usually will find him in monochromatic pottery, or on occasion you'll find him in stoneware, salt glaze, but to find him in full color is pretty scarce. I'm partial to frogs. I like frogs. They're good people. Here's an interesting Stein. You know, we see a lot of Bohemian glass, and this Stein was made for New York, so you have three different views of New York. Tough to find, and there's a lot of collectors in America that want Bohemian glass with American views. This is a Capodimonte character Stein of Pan with a big kind of a domed inlaid lid. So this, Capodimonte made two character Steins. This is one of them. Also made a figural knight as well. Gmunden, Austria, did a whole lot of faience Steins. And you can always tell it by their green. They have a green that didn't stay within the lines. It flowed out of the lines when they fired it. You know, there's standard honey-colored Shearhouse character Steins. It's rare that you're going to find writing on the Steins. This is Old Heidelberg with Perkio. So, and there's some personalization up on the other side as well. So that's kind of just an added bonus when you can find the Shearhouse with something written on them. This is a Russian enamel piece. It's enameling on silver. Just so well done. They can get pretty expensive, anywhere from 20 to 30,000 to 120, 130,000. It's not likely that you're going to stumble onto one. Years ago, there was a guy that came to the Thursday nights meeting with the piece had to be a 2-liter, and it was given to an admiral in American Navy. The thing was as elaborate as you could be. And he bought it at a garage sale for $200, believe it or not. So the late John Tombrow was there, and John Tombrow wanted to buy the Stein. So he offered the guy $10,000, he offered him $20,000, and eventually at the end of the meeting he wrote out a check for $50,000 and gave it to him, and the guy ripped it up. So the guy put it in Sotheby's in New York, and he sold it for $22,000, and John bought it. So he says, I'm glad he turned me down. Here we've got a Stoneware Occupational, what kind of truck is it?
No, I said Poetic Justice.
Oh, boy, yeah, I know, I'm having trouble seeing what he's delivering, but he's a delivery truck driver with horses. So pretty unusual. Here we have a student Stein. It's the name of the college, the dates that they went to school, and then the roster of all of his students that were in his class. So just kind of an interesting piece. Here's another cameo cut piece. This is done by Franz Zach, and the photo does not do it justice. It's got great detail all the way around. Here's a piece that's done like a Royal Vienna, but it's just a typical porcelain body. But the way they treated it with the gold and the gilding on top of enamel, it looks like a Royal Vienna. This has a lithophane in it, and they also gilded the pewter mounts as well, so it would continue the gold, make it look like brass as the usual Royal Viennas. As I said before, you had the Chinese porcelain. These two pieces are from Arita. I took one piece down to Houston, and Dave Cantwell has the smaller piece, and we were able to put them in the same photo. But these pieces are from the late 17th century. Muskau was another one of the Saxonia factories and had its own distinct traits and colors that it did. Instead of, like Westerwald was kind of a gray with cobalt, Muskau had a brown tint to the glaze before it was, they put cobalt or manganese on it. So when you look at the clay color, you can see it has more of a brown than a gray base to it. There's another Muskau with cobalt on it. The bulbous shape, it's got both the manganese and the cobalt. These are all late 17th century. Siegberg was probably the first Steins that you're going to see, along with some of the other Rhenish factories, Frechen and Raren. It's a kind of a white stoneware. They're always 1550 to 1590 period. You'll usually find them dated and initials to the artist. One telltale sign when you find one of these, if you don't, there's a lot of reproductions, is the base, because they're tall and skinny, will be maybe 2 or 3 inches thick of the stoneware. And when they fired it, because of the thickness of the stoneware, you should always have firing separations in the base because the clay was so thick. If you've got a piece and you've got that thumbprint mark on it as they cut it away from the wheel with a twisted wire, that's wrong. It should not. They cut it right off with a knife, and when they fired it, you'd have some firing separations in the very underside of the base. This piece is about 1570. The last of the Saxonia factories that I think I have examples of, this is Annenberg. Annenberg, like Croisen, used enamel, and the enamel that's on Croisen and on Annenberg's is the same enamel that they put on the glass from that period. Only instead of it being on glass, it's on stoneware. But if you compare a 17th century piece of glass to a 17th century Annenberg or Croisen, you'll see the color tones are exactly the same. Here's another Croisen. You've got the lamb, sacrificial lamb of God in the front, and you've got the apostles going all the way around, and you've got to have these kind of globe figures that are painted along the base. This would be about 1680, 1690. And we have one more Muscow that's got the crisscross cut and glazed in a brown glaze. Again, this would be about 1690. Glass is just unlimited what you can find. The average age of the glass blowers was 28. Some of the stuff they put into the mix to make glass was so toxic they didn't live long. You know, they used arsenic, they used gold, they used uranium. They'd come home at night and lay in bed and glow, you know, so. It gave them great color in the glass, but it sure didn't do too much for their lungs. But this is, you've got an overlay opaline where you've got a purple over kind of a blushed purple on the bottom undercolor. And then again, this is what we would call pasty enamel. Now, these opaline pieces were almost exclusively made for the Persian market. It wasn't a European taste, it wasn't an American taste, it was a Persian taste. There's a whole series of Steins that are German made by various factories, but there was a postcard company in this company called Wheelock. And they were the predominant postcard makers. When you went out on vacation back then, you would look and you'd see that the maker of that postcard was Wheelock. Well, as this guy traveled to Europe, he seen these porcelain and pottery bodies, and he thought, well, we already have the transfers made that we would put on a postcard. Let's fire them and put them on a Stein. So most of them are small, about 1/8 liter, but they go all the way up to a 1/2 liter, and I've probably got 200. At Jack Strand, when you went to his house, you see that he had a great deal of this type of stuff. But they were made by many factories, but I particularly only collect the ones that were made by Wheelock. August Sulzer was a stoneware factory in Eisenach, Germany, and if you've ever been to Wartburg, that's the town that Eisenach is from. He was an enameler on stoneware. Initially, he didn't make his own bodies. He bought his bodies from Herr Grenshausen, and then when the Thiem factory in Regensburg was making stoneware, he bought the bodies there, but Thiem only worked for 11 years, and when Thiem went out of business, he went back to Herr Grenshausen to buy the bodies. So for the most part, he didn't manufacture the bodies, he decorated the bodies, and then he would sell them. And it was just being smart. Why maintain a kiln with all that expense if you didn't have to? Because when you fired up the kiln, which would be the size of a room and be 3 stories, sometimes something would go wrong and everything in the kiln, you could have 3 weeks worth of work and it would be ruined because something blew up in there and got all over it. So when you were buying the bodies from somebody else, you weren't buying the problems, you were just buying the product that came out. So it was much smarter. And it was the same thing with glass makers. Most of the glass enamelers didn't make glass. There was one company called Harrick, they made the glass bodies. So sometimes you'll see the same body and you think it's the same Stein. You have to look at the enamel and know the differences of how this factory enameled over that factory and not look at the glass bodies. Here's another blue and white. You don't see this owl very often in the blue and white. I only know of 2 examples, and this is one of them. Here's another Gemunden Austrian faience, fisherman. Just kind of a neat scene. You see the curl at the base of the handle. That's one of the traits of that particular factory. some of the other Austrian factories, the handle came down and was smooth. It didn't have a tail like it does on the Gemunden pieces. This just is a really neat piece of a hunter and his dog with his big rifle hanging on his back. Looks like a wheel-lock rifle. This would be 1720. You can tell age by the shape of the thumb lift. The thumb lift changed from 1700 to 1800. We've called this the Bunzlau bear for years. In reality, we're really not sure that it was made at Bunzlau. It looks like that, but I think it was probably a small little workshop. Back at that time, you would go to the country fairs that they would have over there, and you'd have a bear that had a muzzle on. So you see that it's imitating the muzzle with the pewter around his mouth so he doesn't bite anybody. And he would go and beg with that cup, kind of like we had the organ grinder with the monkeys. Well, they had a bear that went with a money cup, and if you liked him, you'd put money in his cup and he'd bring it back to his master. In this country, you used to wrestle the bears. And if you lost, you had to give him money. He would just take it out of your pocket. Here's a really neat wood Stein with a diagonal design, and in the crevices of the design, there's inlaid silver. This is about 1720, just a really unusual. The handle is silver, and the strap attaches the handle to the body. Here's another Agerman piece with just an elaborate heraldic crest on it. You see again the enamel prunts on it. This is about a 3 liter. Here's another blue and white to the snowman. You don't see him very often. Normally he's just in the regular coloring, but Les Paul has him as a chimney sweep where he's all gray and black for cleaning the chimney. Here's a piece of Fritz Heckert with an eagle. Fritz Heckert in 1666 started a school for aristocratic children for them to appreciate how glass was made. And then they would sell the glass to maintain the school. And after about 5 or 6 years, they realized, hey, we're actually making some money. So he graduated everybody and started a full-fledged factory. But it came out of the fact of just wanting it to be a school. So here's another Fritz Heckert with a double-headed eagle. Here's another one with the shields. Now this piece is made for Lobmeyer. When you do find this, you'll find the Lobmeyer tic-tac-toe mark along with the anchor in 3 stars, which is the Agerman mark. So we know that Lobmeyer didn't own a glass factory until 1920. But yet they sold glass for a long period of time prior to that. So they would commission work. They owned the designs and the patterns, and it had to be made exclusively for them. And the company that would make it couldn't make it under their own banner. They couldn't copy that design for themselves and try to sell it. Oh, about several years ago, Rich Kress ran into a shop and bought a whole set of these, and he sent me a photo, and I think he sent Steve Elliott and a couple other people, and we all wound up with one of these goblets with the American eagle and shield on it. Waldenburg is another Saxony factory. It's probably the hardest of all the Saxon factories to find. It's just, this is a big, massive piece with applied relief. This is also quite early, and for whatever reason, they didn't have as big of a run as the other factories did, and they didn't last as long. There's a series of Diesinger character Steins that are 2 and 3 liters. I particularly like this because it's a student fox, and you don't see him too often. The Diesinger pieces, their material was very soft, so more times than not, you're going to find a little bit of damage or major damage on Diesinger pieces, and the Diesinger collectors know that, and they're very flexible on if there's a chip here or a flake there or a hairline. they're willing to take it because they know it's prevalent for this factory. It's just a neat occupation of a guy out for the day with his fishing rod in the water, and his wife is home and working on his to-do list, but for the time being he's having a nice relaxing day. Here's a occupational to a bird. I think it's a chicken rancher, probably somebody like Neuner who has a lot of chickens, and he had, Helmut Neuner in Nuremberg had the biggest egg, I don't know if you want to call it factory. He sold eggs. He sold like 1 million or 2 million eggs a day. Here's just a really neat hand-painted porcelain HR, and the hunter is shooting the rabbit, but he forgot his rifle and he's shooting him with his umbrella. So I think he was out a little late that night and picked the wrong thing at the door when he went out. But we've only seen this one time. Here's another August Sulzer piece, and you've got a night watchman with his lantern out checking everything for the night to make sure the old city was doing well. Here's a neat set. You see the Master Stein has those the cats on it that are all sharing one big fish. Just makes a very, very neat set. That's by Van Hoyten of Bonn, Germany. Another Vienna with an innkeeper, and it seems like the innkeeper was his own best customer. Really great carved wood Stein, very, very elaborate. I can tell you the photo. I'm looking at it on my computer here, and it's not projecting the same quality up on the screen. It's really very, very detailed and elaborate. Royal Bond made a lot of different types of Steins. John Lamb did an article on it years ago in Prosit. This is just an unusual design for a Royal Bond Stein. I've gotten kind of interested when we did our first Stein College, probably 13, 14 years ago. We did the first one at my house, and Steve Smith came, and before he came up I said, we each had to talk on something, and I said, I want you to talk on Middle Ages, the Middle Ages influence on Steins. And he brought a few copper Steins, and he brought one that was probably 22 inches tall, hand-chased scene, a panoramic scene of the town of Nuremberg, and then the shield of Nuremberg in gold in the center of it, and I just was drooling and drooling. And I actually made a trade with him, and it was mine, but 3 days later he reneged on it, and he promised, that's going to be your Stein one day. Well, Steve passed away and didn't put the note in the Stein, and I found out the Stein went to Russ Kaiser, and I said, well, okay, I guess I have to wait further down in the line than I was supposed to be. But this is a copper Stein. Rich Crest was kind enough to sell me it. I've got two that have enamel on it. When you see this Stein now that it's polished, it's like night and day. Here's another piece of Agerman. You see the lower body just above the flared base, and up at the upper body, that's called riggery, where they take a strand of glass and they put it around the piece, and you can see they took a crimping tool and they crimped it all the way around so you have linear lines in the riggery. When you get into faience, there's a thing called house mullers. House mullers were the very famous artists of the day, would buy the whiteware from factories like Nuremberg or Ansbach, the better factories that had a real white porcelain body. It wasn't porcelain, but it looked like porcelain. And they would then do commission pieces, commission artwork for very wealthy people. You see this has a silver lid, a hand-chased silver lid. A piece like this today would sell for between $50,000 and $70,000. That particular one was done by Abraham Helmhoch. This is an Ansbach piece, what they call the green family. You can see it has a lot of green on it. and that's the reason why they call it the green family. A piece like this today would probably sell for $35,000, $40,000. Here's another house muller, a hunting scene. Subject matter for the collectors in Germany are very important, and they're very, very in love with hunting. So the hunting subject matter, if you had a Kreuzenstein and it's an apostle, it's certainly expensive, but the greatest subject matter on an Annenberg or a Kreuzen is the hunt scene. They'll pay a premium for that. Another house muller, real elaborate, gold washed silver mounts. Here we have a great Nuremberg piece, historical. This piece here, it's good that it's marked because otherwise you'd have a hard time. It's from Göggingen, which is a factory that you seldom see, and I failed to put the mark on it, but on the bottom of this it's spelled out, Göggingen. This piece is just kind of unique. It's stoneware that's been enameled, and you just have this beadwork on it with the initials GK. Just very different. Here's a real nice enameled Kreuzen, and you've got the electors. The electors were the ones that were the rulers in the 17th century. This is an Annenberg, and what's different about it, 99.99% of your Annenbergs are going to have a slip decorated background that's black. This doesn't have any slip on it. You see the brown background? That's the natural clay color, and they didn't, but if you see in the middle of the body behind the cartouche, that black is what's normally coating the whole body, and then they put enameling on it. So this is pretty unusual to find it in just a plain clay color for most of the body. Here's another pointing piece from Nuremberg. This is 16th century. That photo came out of the Bavarian National Museum in Nuremberg. Just the type of thing you never see. Amber is petrified tree sap. I was talking with somebody the other day. I don't know of an amber piece that's in private hands anywhere in the world that I'm aware of. I'm sure there's an exception, but all the amber pieces that I know of are in museums. The last piece like that sold for $600,000. So if you stumble into one of those, you've done pretty good. You're rare to find English Steins with original lids. This is Royal Worcester. It has brass mounts and a brass hinge. It's really a very attractive piece. Like I said, you may find some pieces done by, I'm trying to think of the stoneware factory. Anyway, what's that?
Royal Dalton?
Yeah, Royal Dalton. Thank you. But this is porcelain, and like I said, it's a very attractive piece. I've only seen this Stein about 3 times, and recently somebody had just the bottom on eBay, and they were saying that it was Meissen or something like that. And I wrote to them, I said, no, you're wrong. It's Royal Worcester. Well, how do you know? And I sent them all the information. This is just a curious Stein for me. I guess it was made for doctors. You've got a cadaver laying on the table, and you've got all these interns around it, and he's being dissected, or they're doing an autopsy, and his innards are out, and they're poking through it, and you've got the skull, 3-dimensional inlay. So it's just a real gross Stein. For those of us that don't like blood, I look at that, I go, ugh. Here's another Viennese enamel on silver. Very, very elaborate. Very, very decorative. Here's a color that you don't normally see. You have a really deep purple over a white. So it's an overlay, an opaline overlay. And again, you've got the pasty enamel. You've got the matching inlaid lid. And it's just a real attractive piece. 1850 and 1860 was the height of decorated Bohemian stone, Bohemian glass. You'll find your most elaborate pieces from that period. Most faience is high-fired, and you don't have a full palette of colors because especially red would burn off at the temperature needed. So Proskau, which was German faience up near Poland, and Liebersdorf, which was Austrian, were the only two factories that didn't use high-fired glaze. They used muffle-fired colors, which gave them the full palette of color. Any color they wanted to put on there, they could. But if you did it in the high-fired glazes, you would limit it to the color that would actually fire up. If you see on your Erfurt pieces, your red will always be bubbled up because red would not take the same temperature. It would start to break down. I owned this piece, and the moron that I am, I took it to Germany to find out why it was made. And I took it to the auction house, Fischer's Auction House in Heilbronn, and he held me hostage for 4 hours. He wanted to buy it. He wanted to give me $25,000. I said, I didn't bring it here to sell, because I collect Bohemian glass. Anyway, he made all kinds of promises. It was going to be on the cover of Weltkunst, which is the premier magazine for antiques. And I left it there, regretfully. Well, anyway, it sold for a lot less than it was supposed to, and he wound up paying me 18,000 marks, which wasn't $25,000. And then it showed up at the Winter Show in New York, and the museum in Minnesota bought it for $50,000. It wasn't the money. I actually didn't want to sell it, and I let somebody talk me out of it. And as soon as, once I give my word, I don't go back on it. I would never say, well, wait a minute, I had my fingers crossed, that doesn't count.
And it's still sitting in the MIA, in Minneapolis Institute of Arts.
Yeah, so one day I get this rolled up tube from somebody in this room, and it was the promotion of this being at the museum. So somebody was kind of rubbing a little salt in the wound. Here's the Alpine Man in color, which I've got the Turkish Man, I've got the Alpine Man. I don't think I have a photo of the Turkish Man in color, which has red tones, but a guy in Great Barrington, Massachusetts had it, and I talked to him. This is back in 1976. And I said, well, what do you want for it? So I don't want to sell it. He said, but I sure would like to have a snowmobile. So we went snowmobile shopping. He got his snowmobile and I got the Turkish Man. Yeah, you do what you got to do. Here's the Chinese German officer. And as you can tell, a couple of years ago, it brought quite a price. It doesn't come up very often. I know of maybe 4 or 5 examples. This is what we call the butterscotch Stein. In reality, we had seen it several times before with an original pewter lid, but there wasn't enough on this body to tell us what it was made for. And then Steve Elliott came up with it, and the inlay tells about the Schützenfest that it was made for, so now we know why they made the Stein. There's only 3 with original pewter lids, and that's the only one we know with an original inlaid lid. So that's a pretty scarce Stein. It's a big 1 liter. Having a conversation with Les Paul yesterday in the Stein sale room, and he wanted to know, should he add pieces like this to the character book to say that it's only a half character. I said, I consider it a character, but his idea is, if you spray paint it black and you can't tell what it is, then it's not a character Stein. And the lid should be part of the design. Well, that's still open for discussion. So here we have, there's no raise. The previous one, actually the face is in relief, but this one is just this electrical body, and it's just a painting that gives you depth. But there's a series of them, and how can you not say that that's not a character Stein? It has real character. There's a lot of bicycle collectors, and the Steins that they want the most, you have the tandem bike, which is a normal bike, and then you have the high wheel bike. It's the high wheel bikes that bring a little bit more of a premium. Can you imagine riding that for 100 miles? They had what they call century runs, and they would ride that bike for 100 miles. Okay, this is one of the examples I was talking about from that factory called Canogan. This is a hunter rabbit. It's the only one that's ever surfaced to date. Les Paul has it. There's a few people looking for another one. The rabbit collectors are looking for them. Here's another example from that factory. You see the tilted head. This is an enlisted man. Here we have a night watchman. Again, the head is tilted. I should be done?
Yes.
And you know what? They tell me my time is up. I just loaded the PowerPoint with as many photos as I could, and we're done.